Today on the podcast, my visit to Northern Arizona University. That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. This episode is brought to you by the Scholars and Fellows of Jacobs Premium. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. So today's episode is a little bit out of the ordinary. A few weeks back, I visited Northern Arizona University, off in Flagstaff, Arizona, and I sat with a group of students who were interested in philosophy, religion, and specifically Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, this event was organized by Dr. James Joyner, a professor of philosophy there at NAU, and a dear friend of mine. James is somebody I've mentioned on this podcast before, and I keep on trying to get him to show up, and he keeps on canceling on me, but one day you're going to meet him, and you're going to like him. Now, Dr. Joyner was the one who was driving the conversation, as it were, asking me questions that he thought might be of interest to these students. So he decided to dig in on a topic, the problem of hell, and the question of the afterlife, an issue that he knew was central to things like the problem of evil and lots of polemics against Christianity, specifically in that area. And he wanted to hear from me on that topic. Now, truth be told, James is well aware of my work and my thought on such topics, but that's actually precisely why he wanted the students to hear from me on those issues. And so we just sort of let the conversation unfold naturally, just him and I initially talking and then opening it up to students. And so what you're about to hear is the recording of exactly that. I don't know that you would call it a talk, but my Q&A session with Dr. Joyner and these philosophy students off at Northern Arizona University. So with that, let's take a listen. Hey, everybody, don't forget, join Jacobs Premium to access exclusive content and our monthly book club. Visit the NathanJacobsPodcast.com and see description below for details.
Well, good evening. Thank you guys for coming. We have an opportunity to have a conversation this evening with Dr. Nathan Jacobs. Dr. Jacobs is, in addition to being a close friend, is a colleague of mine. Dr. Nathan Jacobs has worked in academia, in film, and in art throughout his career. Academically, he did his PhD in theology, systematic and historical theology, correct? At Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, has published with top academic presses and has published in peer-reviewed, rigorous academic journals, and has written a number of books that have been recognized in the broader academic sphere with top awards in philosophy specifically. He started out his adult years in art school and was being trained at, what's the institution, Jacobs?
The Maryland Institute College of Art.
The Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, and then did some video game design.
Yes. I paid my bills during my master's work by doing CGI and character design and cutscenes and storyboards and things like that.
I was very early on. In addition to that, you've done some fine artwork and have had things commissioned and have been in that realm for some time. And then, in some inexplicable way, went from academia into Hollywood. And I remember you saying it's easier to make it in Hollywood than academia at the time. How did that transition go from academics to filmmaking?
Oh man, that's a long story. Okay, so how did I go from academics to filmmaking? So I guess it started because I'd done some film work when I was in art school, and people thought I was quite good at it, but I thought, nobody does that for a living. That's absurd. So I didn't pursue it, but I started to have bump into more and more filmmakers while I was doing my grad work, and the reason was because there had been a strike, in Hollywood that created an opportunity, this vacuum for different states to offer tax incentives and try to draw Hollywood movies out of there. And that's how, for example, Georgia, a lot of the Marvel movies are shot in Georgia, the Conjuring movies, a lot of films are done in Georgia. You see the Georgia peach at the end of a lot of film credits. And that happened because states saw an opportunity to say, well, that's big business. That's a lot of money. Let's offer tax incentives. Let's see if we can pull movies out of Hollywood. And so for that reason, there were a lot of people who were in film who were moving around to different states saying, well, let's try the Chicago tax incentive. Let's try the Michigan tax incentive. Let's try the Georgia one. And so there was sort of this race to suck up that work. Oh. And as a result, in Chicago and Michigan, all these different places where I kept on bumping into filmmakers. And I thought, well, that's really strange. I'm not in California. Why would I be bumping into filmmakers? But one of the things that always struck me was they were always so impressed with what I was able to do, the sort of thing I had done in video games, where I could conceive a scene and I could storyboard it and I could tell you shot for shot how it would go, and you could actually film it and it would cut together right and all that. And so a number of these filmmakers had said, I'd love to work with you, if you wanted to put something together. And I thought, well, that's flattering, that's interesting, but I mean, that's crazy. And eventually, when I was at Trinity, I saw an opportunity. And I was like, well, why don't we try to do something? And there was a guy, Chris Firestone, who I believe we worked on a book together that's out there in the hallway on the wall. So Chris was somebody who would really try just about anything. If I said, hey, Chris, you want to try something crazy? And he'd be like, sure, why not? So I said, let's try to pull together some people and make a short film. And we did. We ended up doing this short film, pulling together a bunch of legit Hollywood people. And, and then that sort of, that went well enough that the Hollywood guys said, well, if you wanted to try a feature, I'd do it. And from working with me, if you dangle an opportunity in front of me, it's tough for me to say no. So I start working on scripts. We start trying to bootstrap a project. You fast forward, and I ended up doing a college comedy, Killing Poe. And while I was finishing up that, I had also recently become Orthodox, and I was approached by the Antiochian Archdiocese, and they said, hey, we've heard about this guy. He's a philosopher, he's a theologian, he became Orthodox, and he makes movies. That's what we heard. And we want to do something. So that became this springboard for them commissioning me to do what was a documentary, Becoming Truly Human, which was about the religiously unaffiliated. Now, I was not a documentarian, so I warned them, if I do a documentary, it's not going to be quite exactly what a typical documentary would be. But they were thrilled with it, and I went around. I took time off of teaching. I took this sabbatical to basically go around and show it and do speaking engagements. And it was at one of those where there were a bunch of prospective investors who said, I'm interested in what you're doing. I'd like to get behind what you're doing. Actually, before that, I think the more important part was that I sat with Metropolitan Joseph at the Antiochian Archdiocese, and I screened it. And I said, well, Your Eminence, this is what you paid for, so I hope you like it. And I sat there with him, and he was an Arab, and he was like, I am obsessed with what you have done here. I want you to leave teaching, and I want you to make films. And I said, oh, okay. Your Eminence, you going to pay me to do that? And he said, no, but I will pray for you. Okay.
And that was after him viewing the documentary that was Becoming Truly Human.
That's right.
And in that, you explore the religious nuns, those who are religiously unaffiliated, who identify as a nun, N-O-N-E, on religious surveys. Mm-hmm. And you weave a bit of your own journey into orthodoxy in that film.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I had suggested, because they said that, what the Antiochian Archdiocese was interested in doing is they said, well, there was this growing awareness that more and more people had sort of wandered away from religion and become religiously unaffiliated. And they said, well, rather than going around and just talking to people who are, Christians but curious about orthodoxy, what we want to talk to are people who are wandering away from religion, altogether. And can you help us with that? And I said, well, I have a lot of experience with this group because of my own journey, which was a journey through all sorts of heretical philosophies, and I can talk about that if you'd like. But basically, I said, if you want to engage this group, you have to do three things. I said the first thing you would have to do is you have to humanize them, because a lot of them, they've gone through these journeys, but they don't feel seen or understood. I mean, who are they going to talk to, right? Are they going to talk to their parents who are disappointed that they're not going to church and who are worried about them and are going to try to pull them back? Probably not. Are they going to talk to their friend, their roommate who is an avid atheist and is like, yeah, that's right, and they're like, I'm not really an atheist? Are they going to talk to their Christian friend who's going to probably do the same? And the answer is they probably don't talk about much. So a quintessential example of this was before doing the documentary, I would go around and I'd screen candidates to be in the film. I'd ask them basic questions, how were you raised? Were both parents religious? Were they, the same religion? When did you go to church when you were growing up? all these sorts of procedural questions. And there was this one couple I was talking to from New York who I really liked, wanted to be in the documentary, but scheduling conflicts made it problematic. But they were sitting there talking about it, and one, I brought up the question of, like, do you believe in God? And the husband's like, definitely, absolutely. And the wife was like, absolutely not. And then they looked at each other and they're like, you do? You don't? I thought, whoa. You two are married and you've never actually even talked about this topic. And so it was a fascinating realization that the nuns don't talk, which is strange for a lot of religious people. Like, religious people are accustomed to, I go to church, you talk about the sermon, what are you reading? Might be a religious book, right? What are you listening to? Whatever it might be. Whereas once you step away from religion, who do you talk to? And the answer is not many people, probably. You don't talk about it much. And so that was a realization that I had, that so much of the experience and the journey was closeted. And so I said, the first thing you want to do is you want to humanize them, because that's what they need. They need to know that they're genuinely seen and listened and that their journey is legitimized. And it should be, right? A lot of these journeys are very, meaningful journeys for a lot of people who have legitimate questions or have had legitimate experiences that have set them down a certain road. And so that was the first thing. I said the second thing you'll want to do is you want to open them up to be, open to dialogue, open-minded, but that's not going to happen with a religious person. So you should put them in dialogue with each other. And the reason is because they'll feel comfortable around other religiously unaffiliated folks who they'll presume will understand me. But at the same time, just because they all abandon religion in a formal sense doesn't mean they all agree. And so you'll still get good discussion out of that. And it's like, and then the third thing, you'll probably want somebody who has wandered away from religion but come back. And I said, I don't know who you're going to find to do that, but you're going to want to find somebody. And then that's when I realized, they were like, what about you? Like, you're a good candidate for that. And I was like, okay, well, I didn't want to be in front of the camera for this, but and that's basically what the documentary is. It just sort of alternates between these individual portraits where you're meeting each unaffiliated person, these group discussions where people are talking with each other, and then me sharing my story, which runs parallel with theirs up to a point, right? So that was the nature of the documentary. And that was what ultimately, once I had started considering maybe I'll continue to do film, I didn't want to keep on doing documentaries. I was interested in storytelling, narrative, that sort of thing. But because of that film, that's how I met a bunch of prospective investors. And they said, well, we'd be willing to get behind you on your next project, which was actually a horror project I was going to work on. But that marked me actually saying I'm going to take a leap and step away from teaching and do this because I think it's what I should do. And that was partially also because I saw the sort of impact that can happen in terms of doing broad media type stuff. So anyway, you fast forward, I eventually, the work I was doing in development on that horror project gets me into Lionsgate, introduces me to a lot of different people, and that's how I get a first look deal, and then end up working on House of David, which was the big Amazon Prime show, and have a bunch of other projects underway now.
and you've continued to work academically on the side, as
Yeah.
it were, during that time.
That's right.
Nathan, I want to use some of the themes and issues you identified in Becoming Truly Human, working with the religious nuns, to launch us into maybe the first area of discussion
Sure.
this evening. Many people who have left religious practices and traditions, as well as many people within them, like that are within Christianity and the Christian world, a common obstacle people have is with God and the doctrine of hell.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So we want to keep things light and easy-going here this
So
evening.
you thought that would be a good one, right?
We would go start off that way. Let me lay out maybe a standard picture, let's call it, and let me get your assessment on this. Academically, you were working in Eastern patristics. This would be studies related to the fathers in the early centuries following the beginning of the Christian movement, as well as having become Orthodox yourself. And so these things converged both in your academic work, your personal life. Here's a standard picture, and I want to get your take on this, both as someone working academically in this area, as well as your own personal experiences. The standard picture would go probably something like this. Most of you have probably heard it. God created human beings in a perfected state in the Garden of Eden, and nevertheless they chose to rebel. And in that choice, they brought about sin into the world, and as a consequence, they were subjected to death. And all human beings then are sort of guilty, and guilt of sin tied back to that original choice. And thus, all human beings face the prospect of an eternity of suffering and torment by God, by Satan, in hell. And the only way to escape that is to maybe be able to check correctly on a theological quiz, as it were. And that would probably have to be something like, do you believe in Jesus? And that's the only way you can escape this. Other people who fail to get that right answer on this theological quiz that they might get presented with, so those people will then be subject to an eternity of suffering. That's the picture both of God and of the afterlife that many people find not only unpalatable, but just problematic. And here again, both religious nuns who have walked away or people that are still within Christian circles. When you hear that standard picture, do you think, yeah, that perfectly captures
I figure, why don't we just wrap it right there? That was pretty solid. No, a lot of things come to mind. So looking at that picture, I would identify sort of three overlapping assumptions that I would adjust based on an Eastern patristic perspective. And those would have to do with anthropology, the nature of man, which is obviously going to tie into the fall and death and things like that. It would have to do with God and providence and how God relates to the world. And then it would also have to do with dynamics of the afterlife. But let me actually back up before I start there. So to start with a little bit about my own journey, right, I was raised in a Lutheran home, I suppose, in general. My mom was a Lutheran, my dad was nothing. And so in terms of whatever religious education I received, it was from a Lutheran perspective. And my perspective on that was actually such that I had been persuaded, because my mom was somebody who had gone through different, sort of faith crises and was very familiar with Christian apologetics. I grew up hearing all sorts of proofs and arguments and things like that for the Christian religion. And so I never came away with the sense of like Christianity is irrational. I had always had the impression it's defensible, it's rational. I just didn't think it had any relevance to me, because the impression I had was exactly what you just described, which is, I guess it's just a sort of postmortem quiz that doesn't have much bearing on how I actually live. And so the moment religion was up to me, I wandered away from it, and I became a full-blown hedonist. That would be the art school part, but even before that, I loved, three things, which were, women and art and drugs. I loved all three of those things, and those were all related for me. It was a full hedonistic lifestyle. And I won't give the whole story, but suffice to say that a bad LSD trip, I'm happy to tell this story if anybody wants to know it, but a bad LSD trip was what actually awakened me to several things. First of all, that I'm going to die. Second of all, the possibility that consciousness survives death. And then with that, the importance of religious questions. And so that's when I became obsessive about studying philosophy and religion, initially while at art school, where I was neglecting my art because I was spending too much time reading philosophy and religion independently. And then finally left art school in my third year in order to formally study philosophy and religion. And truthfully, going into it, I went into it with a hope. I was doing a few different things. First of all, there was sort of a Pascalian wager type thing about it, where I did look at Eastern religions, but when I looked at Eastern religions, there did seem to be something unique about Christ and the sort of centrality of Christ and his claims of exclusivity and things like that, where it seemed that there was a greater importance placed on that, a greater weight in terms of getting that one wrong as opposed to some others. And so I pretty quickly started delving specifically into the question of what is Christianity. And I didn't want to presume that I actually knew what it was. So where I started was actually with Augustine of Hippo. And I started with Augustine of Hippo because I recognized that from what I could tell, I hadn't never heard of Eastern Orthodoxy, but from what I could tell, both Roman Catholics and Protestants, which as far as I knew was all of Christianity, claimed Augustine of Hippo as the sort of fountainhead for their theology. If you're going to appeal to some early Christian writer, that's it. And so I obsessively began to study Augustine. And then from studying Augustine, I went from there into realizing that Augustine had been heavily influenced by certain Platonists, certain books of the Platonists. He talks about this. And so I had to study those Platonists, which meant Plotinus most likely, or Porphyry, but most likely Plotinus. And then, well, if I'm studying Neoplatonists, now I need to go and study Plato, and then they're responding to Aristotle, so I've got to study Aristotle. And so I went from Augustine backwards into all of pagan philosophy. And then I started asking the question, what happened when you move forward? And so I started studying the medievals first. I started going through Aquinas and Bonaventure and John Scotus and all these guys. And then eventually into the Reformation, post-Reformation scholastics. And I was just trying to get a sense of what happened and what is this religion. And what happened was, truthfully, in my heart of hearts at the time, I was like, yeah, convince me of Catholicism. I'd like to be a Catholic. was kind of my disposition, because I was like, I'm growing to love philosophy. I'm an artist, right? There's a rich artistic history here. There's a rich philosophical history. Yes, persuade me of Catholicism. But what happened instead was actually, over time, I became a full-throated opponent of historical Christianity. And so rather than being drawn into Christianity by Augustine and his legacy, I was repelled away from Christianity as a result. And I say that, and there's more to that story, and I'm happy to talk about that if somebody wants me to dig into that a bit more. But I say that because what started to happen was a certain dissonance in my mind between certain things that I was finding in Augustine and in Aquinas, and then what I was finding in Scripture and what I was finding in philosophy. And so there was a certain narrative that had emerged, specifically in German philosophy. And as James knows, I spent a lot of time, in German idealism and things like that. My first book was on Immanuel Kant. And so I was looking a lot at this sort of German or this Prussian narrative that was essentially saying, well, yes, Christianity is really sort of this hybrid, merging of paganism, pagan philosophy with Judaism, and it's something new and different, and so on and so forth. And the problem was that what I saw was I started to see a certain disconnect between the God that I was reading about in Scripture and the God I was reading about in the medievals. And that disconnect made it plausible to me, the narrative that I was hearing from these Prussian philosophers who are saying something has gone wrong, and there's some sort of weird amalgamation between these two things that is not actually Christian. And so over time, what happened was I actually moved into these other modes of philosophy and began to cast off and critique and become opponent of historical Christianity as I knew it, because I only knew Latin, Western Christianity. And I say that because one of the things that was really sort of critical in my mind as this full-throated, heretical, wild-eyed philosopher was that I had become persuaded at some point of realism. And so folks who've listened to my podcast obviously know this term. But the basic idea with realism is that, you and I and every other rational person, when we look out into the world, we think in terms of these structures of genera and species and common properties, right? Animal, human, bipedal, things like that. And part of the question you have with realism is, why does the mind do that? Right? Does the mind see these rational structures in the world because there are rational structures to the world, and the mind is abstracting something that's there? Or is it just chaotic matter in motion, and the mind needs a way to organize something that's not really organized? And so we invent a bunch of names and structures and categories to help organize all this stuff, but those are all just names. They're just mental fictions. And if you say the first one, right, that these are real structures, then you're a realist. You say the second one, you're a nominalist. Now, early on, when I first started studying philosophy, like a lot of people, I had empiricist, nominalist impulses, but I saw quickly the way that began to unravel in my hands, and I became convinced of realism. But with that, one of the things that I also became convinced of was the importance of the fact that the most godlike thing about me, if there is really a God, if the world really originates from something like a mind, if it's true that my mind is either a small spark or a small image of this divine mind, and that's why it recognizes these structures, then this is the clearest access I have to what that being's like. My moral intuitions, right? My rational instincts. Those things are the clearest glimpse into that. And one of the things I was troubled by was, why is it, if Christianity is true, that there are certain doctrines that obviously violate my moral intuitions? And I have in mind here certain things that you brought up, right? Why is it that I'm supposed to believe that an infant who isn't yet even a moral agent has moral guilt for something that their far distant ancestor did? And that sort of thing just seemed prima facie obvious that it was false, in the sense that every person, you, me, and every child, knows that there are two conditions for moral culpability. That you know what you ought to do and you have the ability to do it or not do it. If a child's caught doing something wrong, they either lie and try to obscure the fact that they did something wrong, but if they're caught red-handed, their defense is, I didn't know, or I couldn't help it, right? And if you come out and you offer, a grade based on something that's outside of your student's control, right? And like they have to grow wings and fly, they'd be like, that's absurd. I can't do that. And they know that that would get them off the hook of culpability, and that would make you unjust. And so part of the natural question I had was, well, putting aside, I don't even have to go to hell, the hell doctrine, just to discuss this. Part of the question is, why am I being asked to accept certain things as obviously just and defend certain things as obviously just that you and I and every other person knows is unjust? And that's where what I saw with so much of these sort of Latin Western doctrines, not that I thought of them as that, I just thought of them as Christian doctrines. Why are there these doctrines that Christians intuitively know violate their moral intuitions? They intuitively know that it seems unjust that if I do a single moral infraction, I should be tortured in perpetuity for the rest of my life, or more than the rest of my life, for all of eternity. But because they believe that there's something true about, because they believe Christianity is true, they feel a need to try to defend it. And I thought that's a very strange thing, especially if my moral intuitions are in some ways derived from God. And so rather than embracing those sorts of things, I just sort of cast off historical theology, I like historical Christianity, and I just embraced heresy. And I was like, okay, I'll embrace heretical doctrines. But then when reading the Eastern Church Fathers for the first time, during my doctoral studies, was the first time I started studying them directly, all of a sudden what I started to see was, well, the first thing that I saw was that for the first time in decades, I said, I don't know what I'm reading. Because by that point, I was quite convinced. I know what the Protestant systems are. I know what the Catholic systems are. I know Christian theology and its various sort of incarnations. And that was the first time I was reading this and saying, whatever they're describing, I don't recognize. This is a Christianity I'm not familiar with. That was the first thing. And then the second thing that struck me was all the different ways in which certain objections that I would level based on moral intuitions, like the kind that I just described, were actually present in them. And I didn't find the sort of doctrines in the Eastern Fathers that had repelled me away from certain things about Latin Christianity.
And we have two of them now that you've mentioned. One would be this universal guilt that also applies to infants.
Yep.
As well as the kind of eternal consequences for just finite infractions. Yeah. And those two things were the things that you found did not meet your moral intuitions, right. But you took them to be standard parts of the package of Christianity.
That's
and
right.
Here you're starting to think that they're perhaps not.
Yeah, and there was far more than that, and that's why I said, like I said, I started finding a different anthropology than the one that you described when you're describing like the creation of man and the fall of man. I found a different anthropology. I found a different perspective on death and the afterlife. And I also, very importantly, found a different aspect on divine providence and God's goodness and his disposition toward man and his dealings with man.
Okay, so those are the three things when I asked you about the problem of hell, you said we needed to address and think through.
That's right.
So can you take us through these then?
Okay, so I'll start with the disposition of God. So one of the main challenges that I see in the sort of picture that you laid out is that clearly in this case, God is punitive in his actions, right? That there is, and this was something that seemed to be rather standard in Latin Christianity, which is that God is primarily a moral lawgiver, and for that reason, he is a moral judge, and that the human condition is primarily about guilt and innocence and moral infractions. That in Eden there are no moral infractions. The fall is a moral infraction. Because of that moral infraction, guilt is passed on, as well as some sort of crippling of moral capacity that only compounds guilt, and there's a future judgment. And so now salvation in the gospel has everything to do with a judicial remedy to a judicial problem. And then hell, of course, becomes punitive in a judicial sense. And that's pervasive in both Catholicism and in Protestantism. The solution, right, the gospel changes, the message, how God fixes that changes. But throughout the Latin, tradition, Protestant and Catholic, it's there in both of them. And one of the things that I found so fascinating when looking at the Eastern Fathers was I didn't find that. And in fact, one of the things that I found so interesting is that I think that picture of God as lawgiver, judge, the human predicament, is so ubiquitous in Western thought generally that it seems odd to suggest that there would be any other picture of God.
Yeah, somebody who's listening would say, isn't that just what the Bible teaches?
Right. And what's intriguing to me is, first of all, if you look at the pagan conception of providence, and then how that pagan conception is echoed and modified in an Eastern patristic context, it is an entirely different concept. And what I mean is that the concept of providence within the pagans and then in the Christians had everything to do with the idea that God moves things into being and he moves them into being toward a proper end or a proper formation. What it means that he is provident is that he orders all things toward their proper formation and end. And in fact, with the Eastern Fathers, they insist that God being good, what it means to say that God is good, is it means to say that God wills the good of the creature. And in fact, they actually say that he cannot will otherwise. And so one of the things that starts to take hold here, which is really interesting, is that their understanding, it's not to say that God never wills an evil to the creature. And here I probably have to pause and define the term good and evil within this context. Within this context, good and evil are not primarily moral terms. So oftentimes when we think of good and evil, we think in principle, like almost like deontologists, like Immanuel Kant, right? Here's a moral rule, don't lie. And you violated that rule, that's, sin, right, or evil. And, telling the truth would be good or something like that. Whereas the way in which the Eastern Fathers think about it is they think about it in ontological terms, where all that God makes is good. And you can think about this, perhaps starting with ontology, just thinking about an eye, right? An eye, when properly formed, is an organ that has the purpose of seeing. That's the good of the eye. And anything that you would do to it, we take a needle and we start to scratch it so that it can't see anymore, it would be an evil to the eye. We're not talking about morally, we're just talking about good and evil in an ontological sense. And this is where moral good and evil comes into play, when free self-determination, when reason is introduced to it. So now what happens is I, as a being who has the capacity with reason to identify, an eye should be, is a seeing organ, and scratching it would be an evil to it. And I have this free capacity to not only know that, but then act toward or against that, away from that. Now, if I decide to scratch the eye, I've engaged in some sort of moral evil, because reason and free will has introduced moral properties into what was previously just an ontological good and evil, if that makes sense. And so when talking about God and goodness and saying that God wills the good of the creature, first of all, providence has to do with exactly that, forming things and moving them toward proper formation. That was what the concept of providence meant. And then when talking about God being good, what it meant primarily for the Eastern Fathers is that he wills the proper formation of all things. So now the natural question emerges, well, doesn't God ever perpetrate evil on a creature? Doesn't he ever strike somebody dead or, send a flood to wipe them out or something like this? And the answer is obviously yes, but according to the Eastern Fathers, how they see that is they see that in a way that is akin to something like the doctrine of double effect, right? And so the doctrine of double effect, this is specifically medieval ethics, concept. Related, do you want me to pause in order? Yeah. So the doctrine of double effect is a certain, it's a certain way of formulating this concept that there are certain situations in which goods and evils entangle in a way where the only choices available involve evil, right? And the question is, in those situations, what is the good act, right? How do you perpetrate good? And so we might think, for example, of if you have cancer, right? You've got a cancerous organ in your body. Well, we have a couple of choices. We can let it be and let the cancer run its course, and it will kill you. Right? Now, the thing is, the alternative is we could perpetrate an evil by cutting you open and taking out the organ. Now, your immediate response might be, well, surgery, that's not an evil. Well, it actually is an evil to the body. To cut open your body and remove an organ is an evil to the body, just like when I talked about scratching an eye. But in this case, that particular evil has the aim of the good of the being who you're doing it to, right? And so in this sense, what the Eastern Fathers see is whenever God perpetrates evil, he only ever does so with an eye fixed on his providential goal, which is the good of the creature. And so the idea that somehow God would just punitively begin to inflict evils for nothing having to do with the good of the creature, but just for his own satisfaction or some abstract concept of justice, is utterly, not only is it alien to the Eastern Fathers, it's metaphysically impossible as far as they're concerned. Because when you talk about God being good, that means that he wills the good of the creature. So I would start there, right, with one sort of example. Now, this naturally goes into certain questions about things like death and Hades and judgments and things like that. And let me give you a couple of examples here that begin to open up the different ways in which the Eastern Fathers think about, death and judgment and all those sorts of things. The first thing is to notice that a lot of the things said about, in your narrative that you offer, they sort of flatten the afterlife. And they also treat it as literal. And we could talk about both of those aspects. But oftentimes people think of, the Christian narrative as you die, and then God immediately says you're going to heaven or hell, and then you go to heaven or hell. And they'll even talk that way, right? Like, I hope he's not in hell, or I hope this person is burning in hell, or I hope grandma's enjoying heaven, or something like that. And they think in those sorts of terms. Yet the interesting thing that you find is, first of all, when you look at the concept of just taking hell as an example, there was always a distinction between Gehenna and Hades within not only the Greek language, but also within the Jewish concept. And so, for example, if you read Josephus's dissertation on Hades, Josephus, the Jewish historian, he talks about the fact that Hades, and he takes the very literal reading, is the subterranean region, and people who die, the righteous and the wicked, both go there. And they're sort of ushered over in different places, and the angels handle them differently. These angels keep the rowdy wicked in check, and they comfort the righteous and so on. And then he's like, and then there's also this lake of fire, but nobody's in there because that's for after the last judgment. And then when you start to look at the New Testament, you see the same sort of thing. In the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, Jesus talks about them being carried to Hades, and they're both in Hades talking to each other with Abraham, right, one of the patriarchs. And he's at Abraham's bosom. He's reclining on Abraham's chest. Abraham himself is comforting Lazarus while they're having a conversation here. They're both in the realm of the dead. So that's one of the things that is important to understand, that the concept of final judgment of the kind that you're talking about, hell, is something that within both Jewish thought and then the Eastern Church Fathers is something that hasn't even taken place yet. Because it's a post, not just judgment, but a post-resurrection. So notice that Christ, whenever he talks about Gehenna, he talks about body and soul being cast into Gehenna. He doesn't talk about a soul being cast into Gehenna. He talks about body and soul being cast into Gehenna. Why? Because that's a post-resurrection final judgment reality. That's one of the things there. Now, one of the things that's also interesting about this is that because hell, as we're talking about, is a post-judgment, post-final judgment reality, and this has to do with post-resurrection realities, you actually do have a certain indeterminacy prior to the final judgment with regard to the dead. And this is something that is really shocking to a lot of Western Christians, but it's something that's pervasive, it's ubiquitous in the Eastern Church Fathers. Because most of Western Christians are familiar with, yes, we have Good Friday and we have Easter. Right? We have the crucifixion and we have the resurrection. And those are both salvific. In the Latin West, they're a little more sure what the cross does, or at least they think they are. And we're pretty sure that the resurrection is important. We're not sure what it accomplishes, but the cross is definitely important. Whereas in the Eastern Fathers, you have the crucifixion, Christ's descent into Hades, and the resurrection. And the descent into Hades is just as important to the salvation of man as the crucifixion or the resurrection. The question is why, right? And this goes into a broader topic that I won't go into. I'll just say, like, the headline of it, and I can come back to. I'm happy to talk about whatever anybody wants to talk about once I'm done yammering up here. But I'll just suffice it to say that the concept of the cross is very different, within the East and within the West. But one of the main things also with this is that because in the West, right, the gospel and the cross and these things have largely to do with something punitive. It has to do with God is pouring out his judgment that he would impute to you on Christ, and that's why he's going to let you off the hook judicially, this penal substitution. Whereas in the Eastern Fathers, there's something very different happening. The redemption of man in the incarnation is something that has everything to do with Christ entering the human species in order to heal the human species and dispel death. And so one of the things that you see pervasive in the Gospels, that the Eastern Fathers saw as pervasive in the Gospels, is that Christ is, being the Son of God, having the life of God within himself, is someone who, when he touches the unclean, they become clean. When he encounters unclean spirits, they leave. When he encounters sickness, it departs. When he encounters death, it departs. And they recognize that this is what Christ is doing. He's entering a cancerous cosmos as the one who has incorruption and immortality and life and holiness, and is passing through that in order to restore and heal it. And this is one of the reasons why the descent into Hades is so important, because it's him who cannot die and who has the life of God within him, immortality and corruption, descending into the realm of the dead to bring life even to those who are held by death. And so this is, the harrowing of Hades is what this is. Now, the reason I bring this up is because when we consider this, we find some very interesting things within the Eastern Church Fathers. In one of Peter's letters, he talks about how Christ went and he preached to those who had rebelled in the days of Noah. Now, if you hear that, you might think, well, was he just saying, I told you, should have listened? But actually, what you'll notice is that he says that they were judged in the flesh as men, that they might live by the Spirit. And how Maximus the Confessor, for example, reads that is to say that they were punished by being drowned. That was their punishment. And then they were pulled out of their bodies, and they sat in Hades, unable to perform wickedness because they don't have a body with which to perform it, in order that when Christ appears and preaches to them, perhaps they might be liberated from death. And there are entire traditions throughout the Eastern Church Fathers along these lines where what you see is, and there are icons of this in the Byzantine tradition, right, of John the forerunner, who is not just a forerunner of Christ upon the earth, but a forerunner under the earth, preaching to those in Hades. That the apostles were sent not just to the four corners of the earth, but to those under the earth, to continue the ministry of Christ there. Clement of Alexandria talks about that. Right? So it's a very early tradition. And the reason this is so important, and then you can see why you would add to this then, that the church has prayers for the dead, right? Because the church is continuing the mission of trying to liberate humanity and all of creation from death. And so one of the things that happens is sometimes people will look at final judgment. A person dies and then the judgment. And they project that final judgment, which is a post-resurrection reality, on death itself, right? The person dies and now the table is set and that's it. As opposed to recognizing that the story is not really closed until the final judgment. And the descent of Christ into Hades is a critical example of this. That he doesn't just go to the righteous. He also goes to those who rebelled in the days of Noah. Right? Now, this also goes to another aspect of the concept of death within the Eastern Church Fathers generally. So within the Bible and then within the Eastern Fathers, the concept of death is a multifaceted term and concept. So on the one hand, we're familiar with the idea that death is an enemy to be defeated, right? And it talks about him who has the power of death, which is the devil. So you have the definitively negative concept of death that's there. And obviously Hades is the realm of the dead. And Hades is sometimes depicted as a monster that swallows men and holds them within his belly. And this goes to, just as an aside, the Eastern Fathers have a much more allegorical understanding of heaven, hell, and Hades than the Latin West. The Latin West had a tendency to be very literal, right? Hades is under the earth, right? That heaven and hell are locations. That's one of the reasons why the Roman Catholic Church, for example, officially does not believe in ghosts. Because if you press them, they'll admit, oh, well, I mean, if you mean disembodied souls, of course we do believe in that. They're just not here, right? Because they're someplace else, heaven, hell, or purgatory. Whereas in the Eastern Fathers, there's a tendency to see these as conditions of the soul, right? So notice, for example, that Christ says to the thief on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise. But where does he go to? He goes to Hades. He goes into the realm of the dead, right? And yet it's paradise. And Christ says explicitly, I haven't ascended to see my Father. Well, why, right? Well, the answer is because the thief on the cross would be with Christ, which is paradise, right? This is something John Chrysostom points out in his homily on the cross in the cemetery. So the Eastern Fathers had this tendency, which was common in Eastern thought generally, like Alexandrian Judaism. Philo of Alexandria says there's no subterranean region beneath your feet. He's like, you want to know what the real Hades is? It's the soul held captive by wickedness and vice and the passions. That's the condition of being dead spiritually, right? Now that aside over. So coming back to death, you have this concept of death that on the one hand is an enemy, or it's a monster that swallows men, right, and holds them within their belly. This is what Chrysostom talks about in his Paschal homily, where it's vexed because it swallows a man and encounters God, right? But you also have one of the concepts of death is that of a mercy. And this goes to an important part of anthropology. And so I'd said that was another one of these aspects. So when you describe the idea that the concept is man is perfect and he's in paradise, Eden, right? He's in this paradise. And then he sins and everything just crumbles. The entire cosmos implodes in one instant. That is very much not what you have in the Eastern Fathers. So the Eastern Fathers talk often about the fact that, yes, Adam and Eve were sinless. They weren't corrupt. They weren't twisted. They weren't distorted. They weren't sinful. But they also weren't yet what they were made to be. Oftentimes there's language of like, almost like they're children or like infants who still have to grow into what they're made to be. And so you find this in Irenaeus, Theophilus of Antioch, and people like that.
Let me interrupt right here.
Yeah.
Because this might help us a bit. Maybe the first assumption is like, well, look, when I read Genesis, Genesis teaches that he created two human beings and he created them perfectly. Mm-hmm. And then they subsequently fell because of their choices. Mm-hmm. What you're saying by citing these various fathers and Eastern Fathers is not that there's just this different group of people that hold different views, but that actually that understanding of Genesis is not something that it explicitly teaches. That's an interpretation of Genesis, and these fathers are giving us another interpretation of Genesis.
Yes.
And that interpretation of Genesis is that Adam and Eve were not created complete.
That's right.
And totally perfected.
Right.
They were innocent, but not yet matured.
Yeah. So let's talk about three things that they see in Genesis, since you brought up Genesis, right? So one of the things that they see is they first see man as a microcosm, right? They recognize in Genesis that Genesis talks about things in heaven and things on earth, right? And within Genesis, the things of earth are things that are mortal. Everything that dies goes back to the earth throughout Genesis. That's the picture of what mortality is, right? So things are taken from the earth and they go back to the earth, right? But the celestial realm isn't like that. That's the realm of the immortals, right? And that's how they saw that. And then what you have is with man, you have this odd, or if we're going to cite Uncle Screwtape, a disgusting hybrid, right? Where God takes from the dust of the earth, from the realm of the mortals, and then he breathes into from heaven. And he creates this merger, right? Something that is angelic-like, angel-like, spiritual, and also mortal. Now that naturally raised the question for first Jewish writers and then Christian writers, which was, so which one is it? Are they mortal or are they immortal? What do you get when you put those two things together? And the answer was neither. Potentially mortal, potentially immortal. And the will functioned like the fulcrum of a balance scale to decide which one you wanted to live like. Do you want to live and die like a beast? Or do you want to live like the angels? Right? That's the choice they see. And then they see that choice also come through in a second aspect of Genesis, which is that God says, let us make man in our own image, according to our own likeness. And then he goes on and he makes man in his own image, and likeness isn't repeated. And all the Eastern Fathers recognize that. And they think that's very intentional, because what they see in that is that the image is, well, they name a number of things. Reason, free will, the spiritual capacity to commune with God, the fact that the Spirit is invisible, that it's not, composed of, organic matter or something like that, right? They name a bunch of these different things. But they see all of that sort of raw ontology, right, what the Spirit is, as the image of God. But the likeness, they suggest, is actually an active imitation of God by which you begin to participate and commune with God. So now if you're going to talk about, let's just take the easy ones, right? Being loving, right? That is active. Being just being active, right? Being good, that is something that's active. And so this is the sort of thing where they say, okay, when you're talking about a self-determining being, a free being, and here the language in the Greek is actually really useful, because the language used for free will is actually, like we talk about free will, but we're actually drawing on the Latin tradition, liberum arbitrium, which is actually free choice and then later becomes free will in common parlance in English. But for the Greeks, it's actually like out of the self-substance, right, or self-substancing. In other words, it's saying you are a particular creature who has to finish your own creation because you've been given this weird godlike capacity to decide what you are. And nothing else does that. Bees don't do that. They just do what bees do. Plants don't do that. They just do what they do. But you have this weird capacity to discern the order of nature and then choose whether or not to conform to it or violate it, which is really bizarre. It's extremely bizarre. But you have that. And so for that reason, the likeness has to do with that active capacity. The image has to do with the raw nature. The likeness is the active capacity. So here, Adam and Eve, yes, they are not sinful. They are not corrupt. But they are also not yet what they're made to be, because they have to self-substance, or self-determine in accord with nature and in accord with what God would have them become. And this is why that language of children who need to grow up appears in the Eastern Fathers. So as opposed to seeing the fall as some type of catastrophic collapse from the pinnacle of human existence that we're trying to get back to, instead, it is a divergence and a corruption of the species that was never completed in the first place. And this comes through in a doctrine called the eighth day of creation. And so when you look in Genesis, all of the days have a beginning and an end, beginning and an end, beginning and an end, until you get the seventh one, which doesn't have an end. And the Eastern Fathers look at that and they're like, yes, because we're still in the creation narrative. We're in the seventh day awaiting the eighth day of creation. And the first time you see man made, and here you could see John Bear's work on St. Ignatius of Antioch, for example, is in the person of Christ. So the Gospel of John begins by hearkening to Genesis, right, in the beginning. Everybody knows it. Immediately they think of Genesis. And then in the Gospel of John, you have the first time somebody says, "Behold man." And it's Pontius Pilate. And then when he's crucified, it's finished or completed. And he's using teleology language. And what is finished? The making of man. He finishes it himself. Right? Now that again goes into all the sort of things about what they understand Christ to be doing and the incarnation to be doing and accomplishing and so on. But the importance for the question that you're asking here is that you end up seeing that what happens in Genesis is not the collapse of the cosmos, but instead a distorting of human nature, where rather than embracing God and allowing the higher nature, the spiritual nature, to direct and fulfill the human person and complete the making of man, instead that is dragged down and subjugated to the lower animal nature under the tyranny of the passions. And it's basically an inversion of human nature, which is why all of us are capable of reading St. Paul's letter to the Romans chapter 7, and we identify with what he's saying, where he says, you know what, I know what I'm supposed to do, and I want to do it, but then I don't do it. There's these other things that I don't want to do, but I still find myself doing them, and what a wretched person I am, and I don't know why I do that, right? And when Paul's describing that, he's describing something very simple. Translations are oftentimes misleading about this because they'll capitalize spirit, right? This struggle between the spirit and the flesh, and they capitalize spirit as if it's something Christian. But Paul in 7:27, Romans 7:27, uses spirit interchangeably with nous, or mind. And so Paul is just describing the struggle between your animal passions, which, just want to do what animals do, and your rational mind that's able to identify higher ends, but really struggles to actually do those things because of this weird, twisted inversion of human nature. And so when you're talking about the fall, you're talking about exactly that. And one of the analogies that the Eastern Fathers will use, Basil of Caesarea uses it, as well as his brother Gregory of Nyssa uses it. They use the analogy of like a potter making a vessel out of two different types of substance. This obviously being analogous for the spirit and the flesh. And when in describing that, they say, well, what happens if the potter intends that to be a certain way and they start to mingle together in weird, unintended, corrupt ways? Should he fire the vessel? And Gregory of Nyssa says, obviously not. That would make the corruption permanent. So what is he to do? Well, the only option is to separate the two substances and then begin again. And that's exactly what they understand death to be. And this is why the Trinity says in the Genesis narrative, we can't let them eat from the tree. We need to send them back to dust. And that's why they're sentenced to death. Now, on the one hand, that's a natural consequence. Basil of Caesarea talks about that. You retreat away from the author of life. Inevitably, you begin to die, right? It's just a principle of physics, and this is why Basil does not understand the wages of sin to be like God's mad at you, so he's going to, sort of smite you. He understands the wages to be it's just what's going to happen. You start to retreat from life, you're going to die. But at the same time, the gift of dissolving the body, and this is the thing, death means multiple things, the word death. And so sometimes it can mean twisting and corruption. Sometimes it can just mean dissolution of an organism. And so here, the dissolution of the body, returning the body back to dust, and people like Cyril of Alexandria and the Cappadocians, this refers to a mercy that says this is the unmaking of man. The vessel's been corrupted. And rather than firing the vessel and making the corruption permanent, he's going to unmake man, send him back to the dust, separate his soul, so that he can remake him correctly and fix the corruption. But the problem, of course, is if the soul is still corrupt and he raises it back up, you just reintroduce the corruption, right? If the rebels in the days of Noah want to keep rebelling, and then you give them their bodies back, They're going to say, well, good, I've been waiting to do some of this stuff, right? I finally got it back. And this is why it's not just the unmaking of man, but it's the unmaking of man that then needs to be remade specifically by Christ, who comes in order to heal man and restore the soul, so that man might be remade in the resurrection from the dead. And this is one of the reasons why sometimes Hades is viewed in almost a forced rehabilitation sense, right? With the rebels, notice that there's a theme throughout the Old Testament. And that theme is a very interesting thing. I have a forthcoming podcast on genocide in the Old Testament that talks about this. And one of the themes is that on the one hand, you have this odd thing, right? There's this critique. The Old Testament God, he's just always wanting to smite people, and he'd like genocide, wipe out all the Amalekites, leave none alive, right? And yet, on the other hand, you have this other odd tension where he refuses to wipe people out because their sins are not fully ripened. Now, you could read that in a way where you're like, man, he just really wants to give it to them. And he's like, hold on. Just make sure the account is really like bad so I can really give it to him, right? Or you can read it in the sense of patience. And this comes through very clear in Jonah, where God tells Jonah, I want you to go to the Ninevites because they're on the verge of being destroyed. Like I'm about to wipe them out. And Jonah flees for one obvious reason. I would very much like you to wipe out the Ninevites, right? And God's like, I'm not going to let you get away from doing this. And he goes and he preaches. And the Ninevites repent in sackcloth and ashes. And then Jonah pisses and moans because he's like, I knew you were going to do this. I knew you were going to do this because you're patient and kind and merciful and slow to anger and repenting of evil. And I'm so pissed at you because I wanted you to kill him. And then he teaches Jonah a lesson, right? He gives him this plant, sends this worm to eat it. It dies. Jonah had some relief from the plant, from the sun. Now he's upset about the plant. And he's like, you're upset about a plant that sprung up in a day and it died. How much more should I be concerned about the people of Nineveh, in whose midst there are people who don't know the right hand from the left, meaning children, and many cattle. He's even concerned about the animals. Right? And the tension you see there is that God does not want to wipe people out until they reach a point where it's like you are beyond repenting in the flesh. And that's where you get something like the Great Flood. But the interesting thing is he doesn't abandon them even in Hades then. That according to Peter and Maximus the Confessor's reading of Peter, they are drowned in the flesh because they're beyond repentance, in the hope that perhaps they might be saved at the preaching of Christ. Because God doesn't abandon his providential duty even there. Right? And Origen even says certain things about that with regard to Pharaoh. Yes, he's going to harden his heart and rebel against God and do it all the way until he's drowned. But then Origen just notes, and by the way, though, that's not the end of his story. And that's one of, even though Origen is sort of a dicey character, that's in the Philokalia of Origen, which is the approved passages by Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus. So I would point that out. And I said there was a third thing, and I'll just touch on the third thing in Genesis, right? So there's the heaven, the earth, the merger of those two things. That was one of the things, the image and the likeness and all that, the gift of death. But one of the other things I just name is that also with that, within the Latin West, there was always a concept post the Pelagian dispute of a nature-grace divide, where the concept was no creature can ever do anything pleasing to God. And therefore, this is why there's this need for this supernatural support given by God that we call grace that makes it possible for you to be pleasing to God and all that. And so the presumption was that you and I are a damned mass, to use Augustine's language, massa damnata, right? Where we cannot do anything. Not only do we have Adamic guilt, but everything that we do, even when it's good and conforms to the law, is actually damnable and sinful, which is the necessity of sin. And within the Eastern Fathers, one of the things that you see is you don't see that nature-grace divide. And the reason is because the image of God is something that can never be broken. And the image of God is the thing that makes it possible for you to commune with and participate in God. Grace for the Eastern Fathers is actually God himself, right? It's communion with the divine nature. And so when talking about the image of God, they actually talk about it as something that's still there and buried. So, for example, Gregory of Nyssa, when talking about the parable of the lost coin, where there is this coin that a woman has and she loses it in the house, and then she like freaks out and she cleans the house in order to find the coin and then throws a party. Which I always wondered, like, how much was that coin worth if you're going to throw a party? But the way Gregory reads that is that the house is humanity, the coin is the image of God, and the clutter is the passions. And what Christ does is he enters the house of humanity to clear away the passions so that he can find that coin and celebrate with the angels. Right? Now, the reason I say that is because rather than thinking of grace as this sort of thing off in another place, God just has to decide to give it. Maybe he gives it, maybe he doesn't. It's arbitrary, and since we're all damned and damnable, none of us are worthy of it, and so it doesn't matter, right? It's up to him. It's capricious, it's arbitrary. For the Eastern Fathers, there's no cutting the tie to God because you're an image of God. You can bury it, you can suppress it, you can twist it, but there's no getting rid of it. It's just always there. And that would be the additional thing I'd say about Genesis there.
Let's do this. That provides a very different picture.
A little bit
of
yeah.
God and his intentions, the way he fashions human beings, the way he seeks to bring about redemption, and then ultimately how things unfold as he providentially orders the world. Okay, let's do this. We'll take a 2-minute break, and then we'll open it up for questions. And we'll do this. We'll put a timer on you.
Okay. Yeah, that's probably a wise idea.
We'll any questions you guys might have, and then we'll say you have to give an answer within a couple minutes.
Okay.
And then if people want to follow up, then they could pursue those other things. We'll open it up for any questions or thoughts or comments you have. And you, of course, can ask anything. However, if there's something in particular related to the terrain that Dr. Jacobs just covered, so if you have questions along these lines.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Do I need
No.
It's
Just hold it out. Just don't you worry.
No, you're fine.
Yeah.
Right there.
So, in relation to I love what you said about just so much of it, but that God isn't bound by like our relationship to or place of being in communion with God isn't bound by death, physical bodily death, and then Hades and that time of being drawn to Christ and Christ coming and reconciling, helping reconcile people that need to be, that haven't been yet with him, and then the final judgment. So I wonder about like what the scriptures say, that every knee will bow and tongue confess that Christ is Lord, and I have for a long time actually believed that he's not bound by the physical grave. What do you think about the final judgment? Is he so compelling, which I would like to believe, that everyone will be reconciled, all of nature, all humans, animals, all of creation, so that on the final judgment day, there is no one that will be able to, no one would want to, once they see who he is, turn their backs on being in that state of reconciliation with Christ, with God, for eternity.
Yeah. So that raises the question of universal salvation. which I've talked about in the past. There's so if you wanted to go to my theologicalletters.com, you could find a lengthy piece. Well, you could find a couple of different pieces. One is it's called apocatastasis and universal salvation, which apocatastasis is the term that's sometimes associated with this topic. So it's me offering a historical assessment of that doctrine. And then you could also find a couple of things on Christ's descent into Hades and talking about basically the differences in which that doctrine is understood in the East, and then how it develops into something very different in the Latin West and ultimately disappears really from the Latin West. For a lot of people, it disappears. So when it comes to universal salvation and the question of universal salvation, there's a couple of different questions, right? One of the questions is it heresy, right? Like, is it something that the church teaches or condemns or something like that? And then the second question is, of course, is it true? And so when it comes to the question of whether or not it's heretical, where a lot of people will go is they'll go to Constantinople II. So within the first millennium, you have 7 ecumenical councils that take place. And these are basically where there were major controversies like the Arian dispute, which was about the divinity of Christ, and that occasions the writing of the Nicene Creed. And the first draft of it is drafted at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and then it is further expanded into the creed that people say today, minus the Filioque, in 381. And so these are the major controversies. And one of those 7 ecumenical councils, ecumenical meaning, people tend to use it in reference to like the whole house, right, of the church, where East and West representatives come together and they would adjudicate a single question, which is, what is the faith we received? And so that's always the question that those councils are asking. And then when they give their declaration, they're saying, this is the faith of Peter, this is the faith of the apostles, right? And they start to make this declaration that, Arius is not teaching the faith that we received. Athanasius is, right? And so that happens 7 times, and one of those is Constantinople II, and that one deals with the Origenists. So Origen of Alexandria was a very prominent. What's my timer, by the way? I'm.
You got four more minutes.
Okay, all right, okay, got you. So Origen of Alexandria was a very influential early Christian writer, who a lot of people liked. Cappadocians, people I've mentioned, liked. But they also recognize he toyed with a lot of heretical stuff. And so they're like, love Origen, but you just don't want everybody reading him, right? Like, because you need to have a discerning mind. But part of the problem was his popularity led to a lot of people taking some of his wildest ideas and running with those. And so you have these Origenists who start to have really wild-eyed heretical ideas. And Constantinople II is basically saying, we've got to deal with with this problem. And so they condemn a bunch of Origenist decrees. And one of the things that was taught by the Origenists was something called apocatastasis. And a lot of times people will take that term to mean universal salvation. And so they're like, Constantinople II says that universal salvation is a heresy. Now the problem is that apocatastasis, and again, you could read my full lengthy assessment of this, but the term apocatastasis just means cycles in Greek. So it's used in medical contexts for like an eye is healthy and then it gets sick and then it gets better again, right? It's used for cycles of celestial bodies. It's used for diaspora who leave their homeland and then come back, right? And so it's used in that cycles sense. In Origenism, you had this borderline Hindu notion that all souls are originally generated by God and they don't have bodies. And then they decide whether to cling to God or retreat from God, and then they fall into an appropriate body corresponding to how serious their rebellion was. So celestial angels are very ethereal because they clung to God. Demons are thick, gross matter because they rebelled, and fell really far down, and that's why they're just like they're rotting flesh and things like that. Humans were kind of somewhere in the fallen, but not as bad as demons, and all this sort of stuff like that. And so it was this idea of descent and then return, Or what salvation is you're trying to actually transcend and escape the body and matter. And it was borderline Hindu in some of these originists, like Philoxemus and Bug, where they're basically like getting subsumed back into the divine and things like that. And so I think that's really important context, because when it's condemning apokatastasis, it's clearly condemning that bizarro notion. And yes, that included universal salvation. But one of the things that I point out is it condemns a lot of weird stuff about Origenism, that being one of them. But the council also praises Gregory of Nyssa as father of the fathers. And Gregory of Nyssa was a universalist. He believed in universal salvation. And so if they're trying to condemn universal salvation, it's a strange thing to praise Gregory of Nyssa in particular. That's very weird, right? Now, one of the things that they'll point to is a specific canon having to do with that anathematizes anyone who says that there is an end to the pains of hell. And that's one of the canons where, like, that's pretty specific. It's pretty specific. But as I point out here, when you're talking about that canon, you are now talking about a post-resurrection reality, right? And so you could, for example, be someone who believes that Christ successfully liberates all of the dead before the final judgment. All are saved, and therefore, hell is empty, so to speak. Without violating that canon. The canon only says that if somebody does finally find themselves in hell, right, that there is no sort of remedying that. Now, one of the things I would say to that is I'd say a couple of things. So first of all, I think it's perfectly possible. When I speak about universal salvation, I never identify myself as a universalist. I'm agnostic about it. I certainly hope that it's true, right? That I certainly know that God hopes it's true, right? And I don't think it's heretical in a certain form, right? There would be heretical forms of it, but I think there are non-heretical forms, like in Gregory of Nyssa and Isaac the Syrian and things like that.
So that was your answer to the first part of the question. Is any teaching regarding universal salvation, is it heretical? Your answer is no, because the condemnations of it were tied to these distinctive elements in origin and so on and so forth.
That's right.
Okay, then the question is, is it true? Is it true? And there you said you are agnostic.
Yes, so I am agnostic in the sense that I think it really depends. There are a lot of things that it depends on. And I think when you look at the Eastern Fathers, within the Eastern Fathers, you see very clear boundary lines of there are certain things that are true and are, confirmed as dogma, right? And then there are certain things that are definitely false and condemned as heresy. And then you have what's referred to as theologumenon, right, which is this theological opinion that's a gray area, that it's acceptable to hold different views. And in the Eastern Fathers, you find different views. You find people who are very cynical about, I don't know about this whole thing. And then you have others who are like, I think he succeeds, right? And you see that with people like,
Gregory of Nyssa,
and St. Isaac,
St. Macrina.
And we've got our Macrina scholar here, so look at that. I like the sound of that. Is it an acceptable theological opinion? Yes. For my part, I see the merits of it, but I am not somebody who would ever give a full-throated, yes, it's going to happen sort of thing. But I would also.
Let me interrupt you. Give us in 2 minutes.
Oh gosh.
What would be the merits of it?
Okay.
If you could briefly summarize, what would be the merits of holding that God eventually reconciles all things to Himself, and then what would be some of the reservations?
Okay. Yes, so the merits of it have to do with the very fact that one of the things that is talked about is clearly that God wins, right, in the end, that He has successfully rescued humanity from death, and that the entire mission of what you're seeing in the work of Christ is in order to defeat death definitively. Death and the devil.
So she
And-
cited, for example, Philippians 2.
That's
about
right.
every knee bowing and confessing that
That's
Christ
right.
is Lord.
Mhm.
And we see elsewhere in the New Testament that to confess Christ as Lord is to be saved.
That's right. And so for that reason, it becomes, I think, somewhat problematic to say, how is it that Christ has definitively defeated the works of the devil and death and overthrown his schemes against the intents of man, right? This is one of the things that Athanasius says on the Incarnation. It would be unworthy of God. He actually says this. Be unworthy of God for him to allow demonic schemes to undo his intentions for creation.
And was it not his intention for creation in the first place?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, and so and what I don't know how you do is I don't know how to reconcile saying, yes, he successfully defeated those schemes when you have a large swath of creation that is still corrupt and cursing God and bound by death.
So we would have, like in the New Testament, God wills all people to be saved and come through repentance to a knowledge of Him. And then we have so not only his intent, but we have Christ's work, which is having overturned and reversed the work of Satan and others. So these would be reasons to commend the doctrine or teaching of universal salvation.
Yeah.
Other things that...
Are you asking me about the demerits now?
Unless you had other...
No. Yeah, I'll switch over to the demerits, which is to say, put concisely, in the words of Lewis, but what if they're unwilling? Right? And this is one of the things that is a very real tension, is the very fact that, as I said, we are self-substancing beings. The will does need to participate and cooperate in order for this to be done. And so I think there is a very real question related to that. I'd also say this, I'm going to introduce a concept, but I'm going to and highlight it as a strike against universal salvation within the Eastern Fathers, but then highlight something that I think is really noteworthy about it and important to keep in mind about the doctrine of hell. Okay? So when it comes to angels and the question of whether or not angels could ever be redeemed, you find various opinions amongst the Eastern Fathers. The majority opinion is they cannot. Okay? Now there are a few who think they can. St. Isaac of Syria actually has passages where he talks about the demons, being more grateful than others for restoration because they know what it's like to be away from God and the way that they experienced it. But that's an extreme minority opinion. Nemesius of Emesa seems to think that they had a window of time to repent and then it became permanent. But the majority opinion that you find more often than not is that they are unredeemable. And the reason is actually directly related to what I said about Genesis. Remember where I talked about man? And if he's made of two substances and the corruption and you unmake him in order to remake him, their answer is angels are simple beings. If they go wrong, there's no unmaking them in order to remake them. They either go right or they go wrong. That's it. And that is the most consistent rationale. Now, what I find really intriguing about that rationale, that's obviously would be something from the Fathers that would be a strike against all of creation being restored. But what I think is really telling about this, and this is the thing that is really important to keep in mind in terms of how the Eastern Fathers understand damnation. In saying that, what you will not find in the Eastern Fathers is that they are not redeemed because God is unwilling. They actually say the reason they are not redeemed is because it's metaphysically impossible even for God
to redeem them.
Yeah.
Once they've rejected God definitively.
That's right. And this is an important thing to understand, is that with the Eastern Fathers, if damnation, eternal damnation, is a reality, it's never because God is unwilling. It's always because the creature is unwilling. And in fact, you even see this in a story with Elder Paisios. St. Paisios is a very recent Orthodox saint, Mount Athos. I visited his hermitage on Mount Athos. And there's a story where he decided to fast and pray for the devil and his repentance for 2 weeks. And at the end of it, the devil appeared to him as like the head of this like dead dog, like wagging his tongue and mocking him. And the way Elder Paisios interpreted that is exactly what I just said. It's not that God is unwilling, but it's that the devil is unwilling to be redeemed. And so that's the sort of thing that comes through. Now, I say that because also when you're considering damnation, one of the things I also pointed out is that it is a post-resurrection. Final judgment is post-resurrection realities. And I just published on my theological letters something recently, just today, this morning, on resurrection and the doctrine of resurrection. The fact of the matter is that if you trace the doctrine of resurrection in the New Testament, and you can go see that piece, resurrection is not something everybody experiences. And I don't mean all are reanimated. But what I mean is when the New Testament talks about resurrection, resurrection is deification. It is a partaking of the divine nature, a metamorphosis where you put on God's own immortality and incorruption. And only the righteous experience that. That's why Lazarus is not resurrected. He's raised. He's reanimated. But he's not resurrected. The first resurrection is Christ. And the reason I point this out as important is because if that's what resurrection is, then the damned are not actually raised incorruptible and immortal. And that raises some odd questions about, what the ramifications of that would be in terms of this concept that they're eternally tormented or something like that. But what I would say is, in keeping with the spirit of what I said about, the demons, if hell is real, what it is, what I would say that it is, what I would call it, is an equilibrium between God's relentless pursuit of the creature and the creature's refusal to submit. And that's what it is. Now, the other thing with that, though, and I would just say this, is that in keeping with that, one of the things you find in the Eastern Fathers is that if you're familiar with ancient philosophy, you know that fire is oftentimes associated with divinity. It's associated with it in people like Heraclitus and the Stoics and in the Old Testament. And this is one of the reasons why the language of fire in the Eastern Fathers, all this talk about eternal fire and things like that, is actually understood to be God's own energies or presence. And this is where Basil of Caesarea talks about that has a twofold effect. And what he means is that the condition of the person has a bearing on how that is received. And so, for example, with Moses and Pharaoh, it's common in the Eastern Fathers that they read that story as saying, when God says, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart, he's not saying, I'm going to make him rebel against me and then punish him for rebelling against me. Origen actually raises this as, well, I suppose you could read it that way, but that's obviously ridiculous because that's so unjust, like it's unworthy of God, so I'm not even going to entertain it as a possible reading. But what they actually say instead is they point out that God deals with Moses and Pharaoh identically. Shows up, declares who he is, demonstrates it by miracle, makes a demand. Moses becomes a saint, Pharaoh hardens and cracks. When he says, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart, what he's saying is, I know this man, he believes he is a god. And when I show up and I tell him that I am a god, the God of the gods, and he has my people and he needs to release them, that will not go well. My presence will harden him. And this is where they use agricultural metaphors of the sun, S-U-N, could say, if it could speak, I caused to grow and flourish, and I caused to wither and crack, and it would not be saying it's dealing with soil differently. And that's where Basil of Caesarea refers to the pains of hell as a creature who has so twisted themselves and against the good that when the presence of God is there, they find it unpleasant. And you can see this in the ministry of Christ, right? When you see the Pharisees who claim to love God, and yet, as the Logos is standing in front of them, they have nothing but contempt and a desire to destroy it.
I wonder if there's a practical analogy or instancing of this when you've wronged someone and you suddenly find yourself in their presence and you have an aversion to having to see them, to look them in the face, to be around them, and so their presence bothers you. And so if you have God, like as it says, is it in Hebrews that our God is a consuming fire? If God is a fire like the sun, he could both heat or burn, but it depends on how you stand in relation to the sun.
Right.
Thank you for that. Other questions you want to ask? Yes.
Okay, I want to hear a steel man, a 5-minute case
Okay.
of nominalism.
Oh, I'm trying. You want me to steel man nominalism? Okay, so here is part of the problem with that. And I had Jaden, I had dinner with the other night, asked me to steel man atheism, and I had the same problem with it. The reason I can't steel man it is because I don't think it's coherent. What I mean by that, and just so I touched on nominalism just to reiterate that everybody knows what we're talking about, right? It's Luke, right? Is that right? So Luke listens to my podcast, so he knows I talk a lot about realism and nominalism, and I'm a full-throated realist, right? So, and realism is, of course, the thing that I talked about before, that you look into the world and you see structures of mind, and so the question is my mind imposing that on the world, or is it identifying something that's real and out there? And one of the things that I've talked about with nominalism in the past is the fact that, well, I've gone through a whole host of reasons why I'm a realist. But the problem is, in order to steel man nominalism, I would have to argue for it. I would have to articulate it. And everything I would say would require realism. In other words, I would have to I could speak syllogistically, right, in some ways, setting up premises that lead to a conclusion here. And I could talk about, something about the things that we encounter and so on. But the problem is, as I'm going to begin to reason syllogistically, I'm going to speak in groups. And I'm going to speak in groups not as mental constructs that have no meaning. I'm going to speak as if my reasoning is actually sound with regard to reality itself, which only a realist could do. If I try to say, for example, okay, all matter, it's all just, it's not actually different stuff, right? It's just stuff, and then we divide it up. Even if I try to reduce and I get rid of the categories of human, and I say you're all just carbon, right, or something like that, or you're all just atoms or something like that, I'm going to have to use general nouns. So I may have reduced the number of general nouns. Human is no longer one that we're going to use because you're just a cluster of atoms, and I pause at all of those words because I'm using groups, cluster, atoms. So the problem is, I think, because nominalism ends up undermining language and reasoning altogether, to steel man it, I have to utilize tools that are only available to a realist. And so it's like asking me, can you give me the steel man version of a square circle? That it's possible to square a circle. And it's like, I could start to string together a lot of words and give the appearance of it, but I know I'd be saying something incoherent. And the problem is the steel man version, if I'm really going to steel man it, I have to offer you something coherent. And that was the same thing I said with Jaden when I talked about atheism. I actually don't think atheism or nominalism, it's not just that I think it's false, I don't think it's even, I don't think it can be articulated coherently. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah.
I came across a verse the other day which is perfect because it has to do with final judgment, and I just kind of want to see your perspective of it and how you understand it. It's Mark 13:32. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. So I just want to understand the distinction between the Son and the Father, and how how that can be separated and understood in Christian beliefs.
My favorite answer to this question, which is a great question, right? Because obviously the natural question that it raises is, how is it that if Christ is really divine, shouldn't he then know all things, including the day and the hour? And especially if the Father knows the day and the hour, and he's of the same nature as the Father, which is what the church is taught, then shouldn't he know the day and the hour? My favorite answer is the one given by Basil of Caesarea. So Basil points out, and there are manuscript variants with regard to these passages, but I'm going to presume that Basil, living in the 4th century, has better manuscripts than us, so I'm going to presume his manuscripts are the best ones. And so the manuscript variant he uses, I believe, is the one used by the King James Version. And he points out that Christ says this twice, and he varies it the second time. And Basil thinks that's important because he thinks you need to read both statements together and look at the differences between the statements in order to find the answer. And what's also interesting, by the way, is Basil says, well, I'm sure this won't convince any of the skeptics, but it's what I heard in church growing up, so it should suffice for any of the faithful. That's what he says. And he points out that Christ says it once, and he says, no one knows the day or the hour, neither angels nor men, but the Father only. Okay? And he says, if that's all Christ said, that wouldn't be very troubling at all. Christ oftentimes talks about things that are only true of God and doesn't mention himself, right? Why do you call me good? No one's good but God, right? He said, but it's the second statement that gets a little more problematic, because what he says is, no one knows the day or the hour, neither angels nor men, nor the Son, but the Father. Okay, now you probably noticed one change in that statement, but the question is, did you notice the second change? The obvious one change is that he adds himself to the list, the Son. The second change is that he drops only. So when he mentions the Father and he excludes himself, he says only. When he includes himself in the list, the only goes away. And the reason this is important, and this goes to a nuance in Trinitarian metaphysics that the Eastern Fathers understood very well, but most folks don't know and understand. So within classical Nicene Constantinopolitan metaphysics, Trinitarian metaphysics, the Trinity, you have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. These are three hypostases, subjects, right? Hypostasy, this discrete subject, who share a common nature, divinity. But the Trinity also has a causal order to it. And so the language of begetting, which appears in the Nicene Creed, it obviously appears in the New Testament too, he's God's only begotten, is causal language. Abraham begat Isaac. Isaac begat Jacob. It's causal language. I begat a son named David, who has my own name. We have right here, Jaden, begotten of James. Right? And that language indicates that what has happened is that a paternal figure has produced a second subject, giving to that second subject their very nature. That's why Jaden's human, right? And so when you're talking about that language, the Son of God is caused, but he's not created, right? And that's why the Creed says begotten, not made, because it's drawing a distinction between the mode of causation that we call creation and the mode of causation called begetting. I wrote a very long article for a very dear friend in religious studies on this very topic. Now, the reason this is important is because what this means is when you look at the New Testament, one of the things that you will find is that the Father is treated as the God. Throughout the New Testament, whenever in Greek, right, you have definite articles and you have like ha theos, right, that's the God, and then you have it without the definite article, theos, God. whenever hatheos is used in the New Testament, in the Creed, in the Eastern Church Fathers, it always refers to God the Father, because he is the one who is divine from no one. He is uncaused. The Son of God is begotten. He has the divine nature. But he has the divine nature by causation from his Father. And this is how, within the Eastern Fathers, what they understand is that Christ speaks about things that he has, that are true of him, that are divine, but he speaks of them as first belonging to God the Father, and then given to him because he gave him his nature. So, to pick a different example, in the Gospel of John, he says, the Father has life in himself, and he's given it to me to have life in myself. But you won't come to me so that you can have life. And so in the same way, this is what they see here. The only is to say, the Father is the one who sets the day and the hour. That's his knowledge and his role as the patriarch. But, and that's why I'm going to identify that as his knowledge. Belongs to him. Him only. But now when I mention myself, I drop the only. Why? Because I do know the day or the hour. I do, obviously, in the book of Revelation. I told John all about it. Right? But that knowledge that I have from the Father because it belongs to him. It's his. And only his. So that's how Basil understands it.
Other questions?
Yeah, Kip.
I guess this is kind of going back to when you were first studying philosophy and how you were looking mostly at like the Latin West.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up Mormon.
Okay.
And I remember growing up, one of the kind of doctrines of Mormonism was the idea of the Great Apostasy. Of saying there was the truth here on earth, and then Jesus left, and basically due to human error and false philosophies, it corrupted that word. And it wasn't until revelation from Joseph Smith that then the word came back.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of made me think, do you think that most of those kind of arguments from like the Mormon church are more directed at like the Latin West, perhaps, and maybe the way that they're categorizing or interpreting some like biblical passages and whatnot? Or like, is there a response?
Well, I think the response is actually, and so believe it or not, I do know a good bit about Mormonism because my podcast producer is a former Mormon. And so I actually did end up being sucked into the study of Mormonism for a while. And one of the things about the Great Apostasy, so for those of you who aren't familiar with this is a critical doctrine within Mormonism. So Mormonism, it's sort of an odd thing when you look at it. If I were just putting aside truth and falsehood, right, I'm just looking at it from a strictly historical perspective, one of the things that's very peculiar about Mormonism is that I see it as, historically speaking, as a hybridization by Joseph Smith between Catholicism and Protestantism. And what I mean by that is that on the one hand, Protestantism has to justify its existence by saying that there is some sort of this entire development of a Roman Catholic Church, of a visible church, of the papacy, of those sorts of structures, is a later development that is not part of the original Christianity. And therefore, for that reason, we're rebelling against the Roman Catholic Church. And we're not outside of the church by doing that, because the church is an invisible thing, not this visible thing, with the papacy. And so there has to be a declaration at some point that obviously the introduction of papal doctrines, the introduction of a hierarchy, the introduction of Catholic theology is some sort of straying from the true gospel. And we're getting back to early true Christianity. Right? And that's the Protestant narrative that you have to defend in order to justify the Protestant Reformation and say that it's a valid church. Now, on the other hand, you have within, the Catholic Church, you have apostolic succession, and unless you have apostolic succession, then you don't have valid sacraments and all these sorts of things. And the irony is that what you have in Mormonism is a hybrid of that, where the claim is there was a great apostasy where the church went so far astray it ceased to have valid priests and therefore valid sacraments. I'm saying this because I know you know this, but I'm not sure everybody knows this. And so they don't have valid priests or sacraments, and therefore that's why God has chosen me as the prophet who is going to receive this priesthood, and we're going to once again have valid priests which have valid sacraments. And so it's an odd sort of it's an odd hybrid, where on the one hand the narrative is a quintessential Protestant narrative, but typically the Protestant narrative is to get rid of the priesthood. Whereas in Mormonism, it's the same narrative, but then reintroduces the priesthood to elevate it over against other Protestant, denominations. Now the thing is, when looking at the Great Apostasy, the big question to always ask is, when did it happen? What was the Great Apostasy? What did they do? Right? And the challenge is that from what I've been able to say, none of the Mormon documents or scholars actually can tell you the answer to that question. So one of the things that's sometimes pointed out is it was corrupted by Platonism, right? It's some sort of paganized thing, and they appeal to the Nicene Creed or something like that. Now, obviously, I would reject that out of hand as clearly, these sorts of doctrines are very clearly in the New Testament and so on, and that would be a whole different discussion. The other challenge with Mormonism when you're talking about this is the very fact that Mormonism has, within its own doctrines, it has certain teachings that it's had from its prophets or its apostles that it later deems as heretical and rejects them, right? So, for example, if you look up the Adam God doctrine from Brigham Young, where Adam was God the Father, right, within this version of the narrative. And that's later rejected as a heretical teaching. Or certain doctrines regarding, regarding African Americans that during the civil rights movement were rejected, right, as false teachings. And so it's sort of a strange thing, because the reason I raise that up is because it raises this question, well, how far do you have to go astray doctrinally for it to constitute an apostasy, right? And usually the narrative with regard to an appeal with Nicaea or something like that is to say, well, the introduction of Platonism is which again I would say this is a misunderstanding of it. That's a mischaracterization. But the natural question that starts to emerge is like, okay, why is that introduction? Why is that notion somehow crossing a red line where now the entire church is apostatized and they lose the priesthood, whereas these other doctrines that are introduced do not do that? That's one of the natural questions. There's also the natural question of just simply saying, well, how do you read the martyrdom of, and this is normally one of the things I would typically say about, this is one of the things where when I would teach historical theology, and I'd bring up the sort of the narrative that suggests that, the Greek fathers introduced Greek philosophy and somehow corrupted Christianity and, sort of severed it from its Jewish roots, which was a common Prussian narrative amongst the German idealists. It gives rise to like the Tübingen school, and, Adolf von Harnack is a big advocate of this type of narrative. I would just read to them the martyrdom of Justin Martyr. And I would just say, do you really believe that Justin Martyr, the man I'm about to read to you, do you believe he was so committed to Platonism that he just couldn't abandon his Platonism and just had to distort and molest Christianity by working it into it? And then I'd read them the martyrdom. And obviously, on the face of it, it becomes absurd. The idea that somehow Justin is like, yeah, I like the Christianity thing, but I really like my academic project I've been working on. I just got to work it in there, and so the question when always raising this is to say, if you look at the lives of these people who were martyred, people who, were tortured in horrifying ways, people who left and went out into the desert, where is the worldliness where this apostasy happened? What was this great apostasy? And as far as I can tell, like I said, the Mormon documents that are out there don't ever pinpoint who we're talking about or when it happened or what this great apostasy was. And sometimes it also then plays on some odd language stuff, right? So the polemics that will come into play is they'll be like, well, they'll appeal to like Clement of Rome, and they'll say, well, see, Clement admits, that we're not apostles, right? And they take this to mean like, see, Clement's admitting the breaking with apostolic succession. And this is just a very strange thing, because within Mormonism, what you see is that there's a certain linguistic thing happening where what they're doing is they're using apostle as this thing that isn't unique to those who Christ sent out, right? Like historically speaking, the apostles are those guys who were with Jesus, who he sent out, but what they establish are episcopates. They're bishops who then establish bishops and pass their papal authority, if you're going to use that language, right? Their episcopal authority on to successors. But what happens within Mormonism is the treating of the language of apostles as something that is actually the office that's transferred. And so the attempt to sort of defend it is to say, see, they cease to call themselves apostles and even differentiate themselves from the apostles, which indicates that they're lamenting that the great apostasy happened because they're no longer apostles. But clearly, if you read people like Clement of Alexandria or Irenaeus, they're clearly tracing the apostolic succession, right? They are not differentiating themselves from the apostles because they're lamenting that there's been something lost. Quite the contrary, they're actually advocating the succession of faith, which is obviously what's happening in the ecumenical councils when they're saying, yes, this is the faith of, and then they name the apostles and go down the list of the bishops that it was passed through. And so I think the challenge, what I would say, is I'm not sure it's so much about the Latin West as much as it's something that's undefined. It's something that is necessary to sort of offer the narrative of Mormonism, but the historical claim of being able to stake and say, these are the people who were so unfaithful or compromised the faith or distorted in such ways that God said no more and yanked away all valid, priesthood or something like that. It's never really pinpointed, and that's one of the reasons why it's actually hard to argue against, because there's not really a specified claim.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, we've hit our 2-hour mark, so
All
let's
right.
go ahead
Well,
and close
okay.
it there. And thank you so much for your time and coming to the campus and
Hey,
talking
my
with
pleasure.
the Orthodox Christian Fellowship. And so we'll close it out and wish you a good night.
Thanks for having me, guys. So there you have it. That's me at NAU. So I hope you enjoyed it. And as always, thank you for tuning in. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell, and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.